Hello Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 206 of our regular shows. We're recording this on the 3rd of November 2019. This is the official podcast for the fan site avatarthelastAirbenderonline.com. I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime, and joining me is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So on this show we have a couple of little pieces of news to cover, and then the main topic of this show is going to be our taking a look, kind of re-review of the Promise comic trilogy. So we're going to be taking a look back at all of the kind of previous comics over the next kind of coming episodes. And we're, of course, going to start off with The Promise. So that's what we're going to be getting into in depth a little later on. But first, we do have some news. So I suppose first up is just the fact that we're only 9 days away from Legend of Korra Runes of the Empire Part 2, the next comic that's going to be released. We're just over a week away from this book, and it's shaping up really, really well. We already had a bunch of preview pages, but since then the Google Books preview has came out, and we've seen a lot more from different parts of the book, and it continues to look really, really good. We're not going to go too much in depth on this, just because I know a lot of people consider the Google Books preview sort of spoilery, because it just shows you random parts of the book. But I really seem like the direction that they're going in terms of Kavira's getting the focus, them going down the path of brainwashing some of the other main characters, and the conflicts that we want are definitely being brought to the surface. And it also seems like they're doing a few things that are sort of surprising, and I think that's exactly what we want from the comics. So I'm really looking forward to this one. But what are your thoughts as we get ever closer to this Runes of the Empire Part 2?
Yeah, no, I think this is definitely shaping up to be a good, middle part of the series. I think from what they've shown on the previews through all the different versions of it that you can get with the different just sections of the book, I think it looks pretty good. It doesn't give you quite everything like the final conclusion, but it does give you enough to make you really excited with what they're sort of going for, like you said, with who's being brainwashed and who sort of looks like they're flipping sides or maybe not flipping sides. I think seems like it has a lot going on for it, which I think is pretty good for what we've been interested in seeing post that original series sort of ending. So it's definitely, I think, at least going in the right direction.
Yeah, and then for the first time in a while, it really feels like there is a lot of hype built around Runes of the Empire. A lot of people are looking forward to it. The video I put up covering the Google Books preview pages got a lot of attention, a lot of comments, and then even I think people saw some of it and were posting some of the Korra and Asami brainwash kind of panels, and kind of freaking out about the relationship and what could and could not happen. So that's nice to see. There hasn't really been that for some of the more recent books of just I'm worried about what will happen next type thing from people. So that was definitely cool to see. Second smaller piece of news would just be that Abrams Books teased the second Kyoshi novel, The Shadow of Kyoshi. They put up a teaser cover. I don't really know what to make of it. It just had a number 2 on it. It seems to get across the idea that the color scheme for the cover is probably going to be kind of red and white, rather than the first one, which was more kind of white, gray, and a little bit of green. Not too much to say here, because it doesn't really add any new information. But, I suppose it means they're building up to the point where that cover reveal probably will be happening over the next couple of months. And I think people want to know what is on the cover. Will they show off some of the other characters, or will it just be another Kyoshi image again? But did you have any thoughts on this teaser here for this?
Not too much. I mean, I think it's cool that they're at least sort of putting it out there that they're, sort of working on it and when it might come out and stuff like that. So, no, I think it's cool, and it would be interesting to see if that's sort of, has some sort of idea, the whole color scheme with, what sort of happens in the book, or if it's just, a color that works well.
Mm-hmm. Next piece of news came out very recently, just 2 days ago. We got our first in-hand look at the Avatar The Last Airbender figures from Diamond Select Toys. I think they're coming out in or around December, January, depending on where you've ordered them from. We of course have book 1 Katara, and then book 3 Aang, and book 3 Zuko as the first 3 figures in the wave. So we get a lot of really, really nice images here of them. We get an in-package shot, so we finally see what the packaging is like, as well as a confirmation on what accessories they'll all have. I think the only negative for me on this is that it seems to confirm that they've gone down the path of sort of cutting cost on the figures by not having a lot of accessories. This is probably where they should have done a better job at making it clear from the get-go what is and is not included, because obviously since they were first announced, we've seen like concept art stuff that showcased that like Katara came with this, Aang came with this. There's like swappable, tons of swappable hands, swappable heads, and stuff like that. And it's kind of a bit weird now that we get the figures and they each only come with one accessory, basically. Aang comes with his staff. Katara comes with the kind of ball of water accessory, and then Zuko comes with a fire blast accessory. So no swords for Zuko, no giant waterbending effect part for Katara, no Momo for Aang, and it seems like the final version of the Aang figure is going to have this sort of kind of not angry face, but just like determined face rather than the happy face we've seen in some of the other pictures. So that's just a little bit weird. The box just feels a little sort of barren with only the one accessory. But other than that, I think they look really good for what they are. Some of the really up close shots, it may be like I'd maybe like to see a few versions of the figure if I was picking this up off the shelf, just because it looks like paint quality between individual figures could be a potential problem with this, but it's a high enough quality figure that I assume most of it will have pretty good quality control. But what are your thoughts getting proper, I suppose, images of the figures now?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think they generally overall look pretty good. I think at least the way that they set up the photos and everything, I think it really does a good job of highlighting just sort of their posability and the one accessory that they do have, how that sort of works with it. So no, I think I think they're pretty cool. I think out of these ones that I've seen, I think Aang is probably my favorite, which might just be due to how they sort of did the photos. But no, I think it's definitely pretty cool. I think if you're interested in sort of getting some actual figures, since there hasn't been any for like many years at this point, I think these are probably like your best bet to get, and they're not like overly expensive or anything like that. So you probably can get your hands on them, keeping in mind availability and whatnot, pretty easily.
Yeah, like in the last couple of months, like I think they've all gone up for pre-order on like Amazon, like all the different like region Amazons, I think as well. So I don't think these will be too tricky to get or anything like that. When we first found out they were going to be like exclusive and stuff like that to some place, I don't really know how much of a thing that is anymore or stuff like that. Like I said, I think that's just probably the only shop that is like a toy shop, physical toy shop, that's probably going to be getting it, whatever the place was again, I don't even remember. Was it Walgreens? Maybe it was. But either way, online and stuff like that from comic shops, it's going to be like around December, January when they actually come out. And yeah, I'm going to be interested to see what the quality is when more and more people get the figures and stuff like that. Once we have them all, does it really stand out that they're missing accessories or not, and stuff like that. But yeah, I hope they're successful, because I think everyone will be wanting to get the other characters, wanting to see what they do with like Asokka, a Toph, and stuff like that. It'd be unfortunate if they didn't get to do the other main characters. But yeah, that's all the news that we have. So we're going to jump from there straight into our main topic for today, which is our review, taking a look back at the Promise comic series. So this was back when we had Gene Yang as the writer and Team Gurihuru as the artists. It was our first look at a proper Avatar comic series that wasn't just a collection of short stories, because the Lost Adventures had come out beforehand. And I think in general at the time people liked it. I think since the other comics have come out, it's maybe gone a little bit down in people's expectations, though I do perhaps feel it is maybe because some people haven't gone back to it in a while. But that's what we're here to sort of talk about. So in general, myself going back to it, I have read it a bunch of times in the intervening years and stuff like that. I really like The Promise a lot. I've never been someone who had a problem with it. I think it really stands out, especially given where the quality of some of the recent comics has been, especially on the Avatar side, with Imbalance in North and South being, I think, weaker than the rest. I think The Promise stands out as being a very eventful book that writes the characters well, has good art. I think it hits everything it needs to do. It's perhaps not the most memorable of the comics because it's hard to beat The Search, but in general, I think it's just an excellent comic, and they started off very, very well given the task that they had. But just starting off here, Greg, what are your overall thoughts going back to The Promise?
Yeah, no, I think, like you said, it is a very sort of eventful series. I think that was one of the things that I noticed going back and reading through it, since I think I've probably only read it maybe one time through the intervening years since we sort of talked about it before when it came out. But no, I don't know, it seemed like a lot was really sort of happening and they moved things along pretty quickly, which, I guess it's different now that we have, we can sort of read through all the books sort of like together as a series rather than sort of like, waiting for them in between. But even still, I think, you definitely, I don't know, it feels like the characters definitely have sort of a range that they go throughout the series, like especially sort of like Toph and everything that she does with the metal bending school, and of course Aang and Zuko, they go through the whole thing as well in this. But I think it really does a good job of sort of putting the idea of what the promise is, and sort of just sort of putting the focus on just sort of post the series what is sort of going on, which I think is also an easy thing to do. I mean, just in general, just to sort of branch off of that, which maybe might have been something that would have been better had for when the Korra books started rather than the other sort of story. But I think for this one in particular, it hits a lot of different, good beats as far as just getting an idea of the state of the world and sort of the different sides and the different sort of fractions and sort of, how the world is changing up until this point.
Hmm. And I think what really stands out for me as well is that I think the timing of us doing this now, just after Imbalance is finished, is interesting because I think The Promise and Imbalance are similar types of stories in that Yu Dao and Cranefish Town are both sort of two aspects of what is going to become the United Republic, and they both deal with it from sort of different points of view. Obviously, Imbalance tries to take the more bender, non-bender type road and set up something for the future, whereas this more takes the path of looking back on here's where the conflict between Sozin and Roku actually started over the colonies, and here's us resolving them in the aftermath of the war. I think it works much better here because they're doing more with the characters. It feels more eventful, impactful, and it just feels like there's kind of a little bit more of a plan here rather than just the let's just set up the stuff for Korra, but we don't really know if we're going to cover everything type side of things. So I suppose the first talking point is just what are your thoughts on this book, taking its plot and deciding to focus on the Fire Nation colonies in the aftermath of the war? What are your thoughts on that as the plot point here?
I think that actually works really well. I think maybe that's just sort of why this one sort of works better than Imbalance, just because it has that sort of grounding to it, which, I mean, I guess is something that you just have to sort of develop into it, even if it's not sort of already there. But, just the fact that throughout the whole book, when they're sort of talking about the conflict of just sort of this new town and how it's been developed, and just the fact that it has history in it, like they mentioned that it's been around actually older than Aang actually is, even with the whole sort of being stuck in the iceberg. I think that definitely lends to it having a lot more sort of basis and a lot more sort of a foundation to it, that sort of you can feel that sort of emotion through the characters that they have here, where they're going back and forth, and how different characters have to sort of come to terms with what the city actually means to the people that are actually inhabiting it, and just sort of where their loyalties sort of lie, and how they sort of see themselves in the grand scheme of things, and how they can sort of be part of two different things and still be sort of on their own. I think this book, from reading it again, really does a good job of sort of, I don't know, making that really clear. I mean, it doesn't have sort of like all the answers, and even by the end of it, it's not like everything is sort of resolved, which it never really will be, but it does a good idea of sort of showing that that is the issue and getting to it.
And I like that the book sort of in the end end up taking a stance on it, that there is a decision made. It's ultimately, like, Zuko is proven to be right in his decision. Aang comes around to that side. Katara was onto this view the whole time. And the book led up to that decision pretty well, with the idea of, like, oh, in the aftermath of the war, it's obvious that we're going to reverse as much of what the Fire Nation did as possible. But they only roughly touch on the idea that this might disrupt a lot of people. And here we see that, yeah, because this place, specifically this one, is older than the war, because this is the one that happened, like, in the middle of Avatar and the Fire Lord, that first one, then a few years passed. This has been a colony that's been around a very long time. People have roots here, and the complex point of basically the idea of Korra as a character comes up, of, like, she is an earthbender, but she considers herself to be more Fire Nation in terms of what her nationality is, and her family is, mother's earthbender, father's Fire Nation, and that's a really complex idea that Katara latches onto straight away, but Aang doesn't quite, because he's very much like, I have to do things in the Avatar way, which is keeping the nation separate. And then Zuko's kind of like, oh, I support this because I have to be seen as the Fire Lord, the new Fire Lord, to fix things after the war, but I also have to stand up for my people, and he's kind of lost in that. So I really liked how they just set up most of the characters. Like, even King Kwei, they give an arc to in this book, with regards to, like, he hasn't had a chance to really do anything as the Earth King. Here, after all of the sort of humiliation he suffered, here's his chance to act, and he goes a little overboard and has to kind of learn to settle down. That another part of this book is just dealing with the idea of all these, like, inexperienced leaders. Like, they're all brand new to the role, pretty much. Like, Aang's not, like, rebelling against the Fire Nation anymore. He is the Avatar, respected in the world. He has to make some decisions. Zuko's the Fire Lord. He has to make decisions. Kwei is actually outside of the corruption. He's now the king. He makes decisions. But none of them are perfect at it. And I really like that. What are your thoughts on that? The three kind of main leader characters here, and how they were used with regards to the Yu-Dao conflict.
Yeah, no, I think that is really good, and I think that it's a point that the book makes a lot, especially sort of end. They talk about sort of the flaws that, our characters have, that Aang has, that Zuko has, and that you can sort of see in Kwei, and just in general how they have to sort of come to terms with what they have sort of, like, been brought up to sort of believe, and what they have to sort of realize, that might necessarily have to be the way that things are done. How, and, he takes, he always takes into consideration pretty much sort of like everything, but, he has to realize that sort of, the times that he currently lives on, which aren't what he's used to, what he hasn't been, lived in for, 100 years previously, doesn't really fit with the times. He has to sort of, branch off, as you see him do at the end of the book, with sort of stepping away from Roku, as sort of like, taking his advice almost for, word for word. And then even with Zuko, just sort of his idea of what leadership is, and what he's, he always talks about sort of how he, he has these two sides, and how he sort of, always, doesn't know what particular thing is actually right to do. I mean, you see him, have, as, is normal to his character, I guess, just sort of all this sort of turmoil, and sort of, trying to figure things out. I mean, he's constantly sort of going to his father for advice, which, reading it as sort of a viewer, like, that can't be sort of a good thing, but, it does, force him to think about certain things, and sort of, relive things, and sort of, eventually come to his own conclusions as well. And sort of, Kwei just, for him, it's just sort of being outside of the palace, period, is enough to sort of, make him really sort of think about things, and just realize that, things aren't the way that he sort of thought they were, just from, being only inside of the palace, not even getting to the outer walls.
Mm-hmm. And what's the first talking point you want to bring up?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll switch gear a little bit, and just sort of seeing this for, having not necessarily, I guess, sort of viewed these comics as well, just sort of, I guess, just sort of comparing the style of these comics in general, just sort of visually to sort of what we see sort of now, either in Korra or sort of in Avatar, and just sort of, I guess, just sort of the designs in general. I mean, I noticed in this one, it's probably just for effect, just sort of how much sort of stress they sort of put on sort of like Zuko as far as design, which I guess is just akin to sort of what he has to go through just in general. But I guess just sort of the look overall on these, as you would think, compared to sort of what we see now.
Yeah, like I think a lot of it is on like the art here, and I've always loved Team Gurihiru's work, and that I think they got criticized a little early on for like the characters feel very young just with the designs that they have being so more in the cartoony side of things. But you see their growth even just across like part 1, 2, and 3 of The Promise, and then pretty much by the time you're like midway through the search, they have their style down where they have a better way of getting across, like, okay, the characters are meant to look a little older here. But even like you say in this book, they do a good job at getting across the stress that Zuko is under, that he's really, really struggling, that like has had like 5 assassination attempts against him. He's barely had that much sleep, and he's struggling with that turmoil so much. He's meeting with Ozai at nighttime, keeping things from May, and he really is just struggling with all aspects of everything. I like that, and I like they obviously got their chance here to sort of design the new character designs for the characters like a year on, and the slightly updated looks for certain characters and so on. And I think it works overall. And like, yeah, I think the art has been overall great across like all of the comics. I think maybe Irene Co and Turf Wars maybe being the only sort of like weaker kind of point that we've seen. But they all have their own styles. Like I still maintain I'd love to see Team Guru come back at some point and do more Avatar. But they seem to have found their success, I think, at Marvel these days. But I still always go back to like they started off the Avatar comics, and they've done just a fantastic job throughout. I think it works so well here because they're able to do the humorous scenes well, but also the serious scenes really well. And I think bending has always looked great when they do it. So, what are your own thoughts on the sort of style here?
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point of them being able to sort of go back and forth with the more serious stuff and the more humorous stuff, which I think is something that's just sort of, is akin to the show in general. So I think, for them sort of starting off the series, like you mentioned, I think it definitely worked that it was able to sort of branch that and just sort of, just sort of the feel in general, even if it does feel, a bit sort of more cartoony. I think that definitely helps because, the show is a cartoon, it's an animation, so that sort of, I think, helps it feel grounded, like the frames are really, more so taken from sort of the show rather than sort of like, maybe your more sort of traditional sort of comic sort of hard style of edging of the designs of characters. This feels, more fluid, like they're not afraid to sort of, bend the physics a little bit, even if it is a frame, and those things are obviously more noticeable rather than sort of in motion. I think that, helps the feel of the show, and the comic, how it sort of, goes one to one. So for this, I think for this following up, the series, I think this really, I think that style helped, a lot of people sort of get into it, I think.
Yeah, like I think there's a good scene in part 1 that really highlights like how well they're able to do just the sort of transition between tones, and it's when Aang and Katara go to see Zuko, and they go in there and immediately like a fight starts, but they initially play it up as being more sort of comedy, like Aang's just dodging around the place, and then he eventually gets a little bit of his clothes set on fire, and Katara comes in and just like owns them all with the kind of humorous, thing like, stop trying to set my boyfriend on fire. And then it gets super serious, and you can sort of see that the tone changes a bit, and the art because of that also sort of changes a little bit as Aang kind of goes Avatar state here as he thinks Zuko's going overboard, and it's stuff like that I think works super well, that they're able to transition between a lot of like more comedy focused scenes with like say Toph or metal bending students for the most part, to say the very you have to create a very serious tone for the scenes where Ozai and Zuko are talking, and the color palette has to be very dark because this is this, illicit meeting that's not meant to be happening really. So I think they do a great job with that throughout. My own next talking point, I suppose, is just something I end up bringing up a lot just in general, and it's interesting to go back to when it actually happened, and that is that this is the book where Mei and Zuko break up, and they're still not back together yet. And then I look back on the inside like cover basically of part 1 and 2 and stuff like that, and I see like this book came out in 2012 and we're in 2019 now. It's like over 7 years later, and this is still a plot point that hasn't quite yet been brought back. And like this is where some of the pacing maybe problems with the comics as they progress kind of comes in, and it's like I think everyone at this point in Avatar just wants to see them confirm that really obvious stuff that we probably should know at this point, of just what are the endgame relationships and so on. And it feels like we're pretty much ready to do that, in that like Smoke and Shadow did most of the groundwork towards getting them back together, but it didn't quite do it. And clearly the intent is to get them back together, but it's been 3-4 years since that book and we still don't have it. And it's one of those things where like I think it makes sense that the breakup happens here. The way Zuko acts in the like early sections of this book, how much he lets everything affect him, the fact that like Mei only has 1 or 2 scenes kind of highlights that he's not talking to her all that much, and he's just like lost in the decision making process, and she decides that she can't be with him because of that, and it makes sense, and it adds to his kind of frustration that he lost Mei in all of this, and it works. It's just like, can we please come back to this plot point at some point? But what are your thoughts on the Mei and Zuko breakup?
Yeah, no, that definitely was one of my points as well. And yeah, no, it is interesting to see it here. And, it is many years later and we still don't really have an answer to it. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting that that's sort of one of the things that they're sort of shying away from. I mean, I don't know if them sort of like getting back together would, force the story to sort of move on in a direction that maybe they're not quite prepared to sort of go to, sort of like, it's just sort of, if they're back together, sort of, pushes the story forward to a point where they have to make sort of more decisions on the parts of the characters, and that's not really sort of where they want to get to. I mean, just with sort of the recent collection that came out, just sort of, seeing the one other sort of side story of Mei that we have, where we have the whole thing with her father and the sort of date that she goes on for a little bit. It's interesting to see that really, is the only really sort of like information interim that I can even think of that they sort of mentioned them of any sort of note. So no, I don't know. It's interesting that this is sort of one of those points that just sort of hasn't really been moved, or hasn't brought up any sort of other sort of plausible sort of option of them not getting back for any sort of reason.
And your next talking point?
Yeah, so I guess, I don't know, want to talk, I guess this is sort of on top, sort of just on the idea of just sort of metal bending in general, but, just sort of seeing Toph as a character in this one, and sort of seeing her specific sort of developments, as I feel like we're always sort of talking about her throughout the comic series, and just sort of her sort of like making progress as far as what we, would typically see as far as a character sort of like, growing up and maturing versus, sort of going backwards in sort of her ideas about things. I thought it was interesting to see how she was in sort of this one with her students specifically, and how she was sort of willing to sort of let go of certain things and then sort of was able to sort of bounce back from it.
Yeah, like this as the side plot in the book, I think really, really works in that, arguably like Imbalance again and Promise, the sort of similarities. Toph plays a big role in Imbalance, especially Imbalance Part 2, and it's sort of similar here. The Promise Part 2 is where most of the Toph stuff happens, and I think it's a really good book for her, because you have her throughout most of her scenes just like being usual, like amazing Toph, like just jumping off Appa, doing awesome earthbending, and screaming at people that she's the best earthbender in the world, and getting that attention for it. But then the book is able to deliver a pretty good character arc moment here, of the fact that she talks about how cool it was that she finally discovered more metal benders, and I like the details they go through of like she senses on her space bracelet, basically, if she ever walks by earthbenders who are, getting super emotional, she senses them sort of connecting with the space bracelet, which is a very easy thing for metal benders to manipulate, and that's how she can sense if someone has the potential to do metal bending. And so she starts up a school. She's the inventor of the technique. Of course she wants to maintain that legacy, and it's just not quite working, and you can tell that part of it is just like her herself is not at this point like the most suited to be a teacher. Like she just about got there with regards to like training Aang, but like it took a lot to finally make that breakthrough, and you could tell that Toph sort of struggles with some of that stuff when like if they're struggling, how does she break through to them, and she feels it's all sort of falling apart at this point. Like Sokka's joined her to try and help, and it's just not working, and she realizes that she's placing too much pressure on them and is kind of hurting them in some ways, and that's exactly how she felt at the time with her parents, and it's what led to her discovering metal bending in the first place. I really like the whole pressure and pain sort of speech that she has here, and the fact that the students overhear this, and they don't see it as like her being disappointed in them. It's that no, like they liked the fact that Toph saw their potential, that they all viewed themselves as like basically just their character trait. Like Penga's just all about the shoes. Hotun is just about doom and being scared all the time, but she had some hope that they could become metal benders, and I like that. It's not a particularly amazing character arc for the three students, but it's solid, and in their appearances in comics since then, I think they have been better and they've been more fleshed out, as they are the other main metal benders in the world, and I think they sort of stand out like that. I think especially in I think it's North and South we do get to see a little bit of them. They come across quite well, and I think that's a praise here, in that like Gene Yang introduces these new characters here, and he comes back to them a few times, and while they're not the most amazing characters, they're interesting. They're notable because here are metal benders number 2, 3, and 4, and I thought they gave Toph a nice arc here with the duel against the firebending school, and in the end that they win with the coins and all that sort of stuff, and then they fight on the battlefield together. It's nice to, as you see, the sort of trust properly develop here between the students and the master. But what are your own thoughts on the students and just the Toph's whole metal bending plot here?
Yeah, no, I think that development that they have throughout the course of this, book series here, I think does pretty well to sort of, place Toph as a sort of, a developing character. I mean, she's still, not perfect by sort of any means, and she still has a lot to go. I mean, she's, not much older than her students that she has. So, it's not surprising, I guess, in a way that she's not sort of perfect at training them, having only really had, one other, student who's already, a master of his own sort of elements. So, it was a sort of a learning curve for her there, but not as much so as it is with her new students here, who have at the current time at the beginning just sort of like the affinity maybe to metal bend, not even sort of like the real thing, and none of them do any sort of like normal sort of earth bending that we sort of see. So it's interesting just sort of her sort of coming to terms with that, and sort of placing all this sort of stress on herself. I think it's really interesting, and I really liked I think this was like you said, this is probably one of her sort of like better arcs that I can think of throughout the course, where it actually seems like she's making some sort of progress, some sort of strides to being, maybe the character that we sort of see, later on, just in general from what we know of her.
Yeah, and I think it's something like that scene with Sokka that was missing from Imbalance. Like we got a lot of Toph in Imbalance, but it was all just fighting, and it was weird, like looking at Imbalance again, where like they had the whole Toph and Yaling set up throughout all of part 2. Then they have like a borderline 20-page fight scene in part 3, and then Yaling is just like back turned at the end in prison, and it's like, like what was the point of that? Like, where did that go? There was no like, I'll take you on as a student and actually make you like even better and actually make you a metal bender. And I think the only thing we're sort of waiting for really with the plot point set up here is to really see how the metal bending school like transitions from here in terms of where do we get metal bender police force from. Like the idea of the metal whips and stuff like that is beginning to come in, but where does the real sort of transition point happen now that we sort of have Toph in this kind of odd position where she's kind of focused on like her father's business to a certain degree, so she's linked to Cranefish Town, but she also still has her school. I think that's what we're waiting to see. Like, when's the next big Earthbender who comes into play? When does it become police sort of transition stuff? And I think that's one of the next things I think they need to do with Toph. Do you have any thoughts on where they're going to go with that to fully begin to connect those dots on metal bending?
Yeah, no, that is interesting. I mean, it feels like, we've seen enough sort of hints, especially with the last one, of sort of, where these different sort of ideas can come from and sort of where, her as a character herself can sort of start taking roots maybe and sort of developing into sort of, I guess, sort of the later, her older character that we sort of know of a bit of from Korra. So I don't know, I think that would be, I mean, if she, she has, like you mentioned, such to focus on sort of, being an executive partner in her father's sort of company and sort of that whole thing. But that seems like, I don't know, I mean, for me, that seems like that would be a perfect segue into her sort of, being in town, being on the force, being one of those trusted sort of benders that can sort of, help with sort of this, sort of issue that the town is sort of having and sort of policing everything. I mean, it seems now that like almost all the stars are sort of like aligned for her to sort of, start taking in this sort of role. Maybe not like the perfect sort of like leadership sort of chief of police thing quite yet, but at least being one of those people that can sort of, be sort of held accountable for those sort of ideas and sort of, for her being such sort of like, always sort of a action, sort of oriented character who's always sort of like, do things first and then sort of figure things out later. I mean, even if she, she still needs sort of the other side, sort of more sort of, thinking sort of more sort of, I guess, sort of contemplating sort of side. We haven't quite seen that as developed as much yet, but that seems that that's where, if she's on this team with other people, on sort of like her level, if not sort of like her bending level, her being sort of the greatest earthbender of all time, that, this would be the time where that could start coming to fruition.
Yeah. We're sort of waiting to see Toph, I suppose, calm down a little bit as she sort of, like, becomes an adult effectively, because, like, it's hard to see this character in any way being put in a like kind of police authority position, still acting like exactly as she acts right now. So it's kind of like, how does that development really happen necessarily? But still, the setup here is pretty good. On another sort of side plot that the comic has as well, that happens at roughly the same time as the Metalbender plot, it's basically what Katara and Aang do, and that is that they come across the Avatar Aang fan club, which becomes a plot point across part 2 and part 3, as we meet the Yu Dao chapter of the fan club, then the Bossing Say chapter of the fan club, and it's Aang getting to meet people who are just honestly interested in air nomad culture, and he has so much fun hanging out with them the first time that he sees it, and this is where they set up that little bit of a sort of jealousy little moment for Katara. She's a bit put out that the fan club is all girls and they're interested in Aang, and she's getting a little bit ignored in all of this, but then they really sort of turn it around at the end of that sequence when Aang just says to Katara, like, it was like being back with my people again, and she realizes, like, how could I have even thought that he was just enjoying the, female attention when, yeah, like, he's the last airbender. Of course he would care about people showing interest in his culture and, like, collecting relics of the air nomads for him. And it's one of those ones where it's just, I think it's a nice character moment for Katara to be like, maybe I should, like, care more about that sort of stuff with him. Have I shown enough interest in his culture? And so, when you get to the end of the book and he actually accepts them all as the Air Acolytes, the start of the Air Acolytes, it's nice to just see her in the background, like just listening in. She's not like a direct part of it, but she's listening in, paying attention, and she's enjoying seeing Aang kind of, get to like experience his culture more with kind of other people. I thought that was just a nice arc to have. They also have the whole kind of bit where he gets frustrated with the other club, which takes the air nomad tattoos, and like they didn't earn them and they have to kind of learn that, but they sort of redeem themselves later on by being peaceful on the battlefield and sort of stopping the battle from breaking out. So what were your thoughts on the inclusion of the fan club, which becomes the Air Acolytes in this book?
Yeah, no, I think that definitely was a nice touch. I mean, knowing that where it sort of like turns into, I think is cool to see sort of, Aang have this sort of reconnection with his culture, sort of being, the last Airbender, seeing people that, are really sort of interested in the culture. Maybe they don't sort of like understand it perfectly because, there really isn't anyone else around to sort of, teach them, sort of the proper ways of doing things and what sort of the arrows mean and sort of, how everything sort of works. But yeah, no, seeing them sort of on the battlefield and just sort of, seeing, how they're sort of interested in it and just, I think it's a really nice way to sort of start the whole idea of the air acolytes and sort of how that, sort of spreads out as we see, eventually sort of happens later on and just, having Katara sort of be, eventually sort of understanding this and being sort of included in this just because of, her relation with Aang, I think is a nice way to sort of bring that sort of full circle and sort of, start this sort of redeveloping to where, eventually becomes later on where there are more airbenders. I think it's nice to see where it all sort of started.
And your next talking point?
I guess sort of maybe sort of on that, but I guess just sort of any sort of I guess sort of like little sort of callback moments that you have or that you thought of through reading this to sort of like the original series. I was thinking just sort of one particular where they have one with Toph and the whole idea of not being able to sort of see underground and just sort of the different sort of I guess sort of scenes like they have sort of with like Iroh and Zuko in the end, and sort of those sort of, I guess, sort of moments that seem sort of reminiscent of sort of what we've seen in the show.
Yeah, I think it does a good job at like referencing Avatar without just the book being nothing but references in terms of like um I like that like a lot of the character dynamics here like it's not just sort of copying ones we've seen previously in the show, which I think is maybe something you can level a little bit at like imbalance, that it was just sort of with some of the characters just kind of like repeating like their traits that we've seen before, whereas they felt fairly unique here. But yeah, there is some nice kind of references in all of this that are pretty well done, like you say, the with the Zuko stuff, like yeah, the scene where we finally get like, wait, where is Iroh in all of this? And he looks at the image of Iroh, and it kind of feels like the kind of Zuko alone type stuff where he's gone away from Iroh and he's gone down the wrong path, and it feels like it's sort of happening again, but ultimately he manages to get back on track without quite needing Iroh, and then Iroh comes in at the end. On a similar note, I like the dream sequence at the start of part 3, that Zuko sees like the kind of spirit of Ursa in the background, and it's a nice little setup for the search, but also highlighting that this is a reference. Of course, his mother was important in the show itself. The other thing would just be, I like at the very very start of the promise that how they linked all the scenes together to start us off. That they basically say the harmony restoration movement was an idea that was basically set up in between the end of the series and the kind of epilogue scene in the Jasmine Dragon, that was talked about. Then they go to the Jasmine Dragon, and then we see Aang and Aang Katara's kiss, and the aftermath of that as well. That they cover. Here's what happens next. Like Sokka walks out, and it's the start of the kind of Oogie's kind of plot throughout the book. And then they do a similar thing with Zuko's talk with Ozai. They add more onto it, and it's the setup for you'll come back to me. I know you'll need my advice when you do bring tea. Those I think were very good moments as well to just reference them. And then the other one, I suppose, is just King Kwei in general. Like his arc is very much informed by the fact that he didn't really do anything as a leader in ATLA, so he tries to make up for that here. But any more kind of thoughts from this stuff on you?
Yeah, no, I think what you mentioned, just sort of how it relates, I guess, sort of initially to the end of the series and sort of expands upon it, I think is definitely really good to do. I think, post that, all the conversations, they feel sort of in world in general, which I think is just, something that the series has always done pretty well in general, just sort of taking itself, just sort of always taking the cues from the original series, just with the direction that it has. But yeah, no, I think it does a really good job of just sort of keeping everything sort of sort of in the universe in sort of flow, which I think is probably one of the strongest things about Avatar and even Korra comics in general.
hmm I suppose the next thing I want to talk about is, I suppose, Aang and Roku, because the way they do it with Zuko and Aang is that it's both them getting advice from someone close to them and how they deal with that advice. Do they just take it and run with it, or do they apply their own ideas to it as well? And it's really like, as leaders, how much of this do they do on their own versus take advice from others? And with Aang, he primarily in this book, of course, gets advice from Roku by meditating to talk to Roku, and so Roku ultimately agrees with the idea of the promise, and he thinks it was, Zuko said it. He wasn't like overly emotional when he said it. It was him in his clear mind saying this, wanting this, as a way to get out of things if things do go bad. And he thinks that this is a good idea because it comes from his perspective, where Roku feels like he failed by not taking out Sozin. And I like that you're able to sort of get a little bit of Roku's character there as well, that it links into the whole Avatar and the Fire Lord, and asking you to think about, like, in reflection, he's constantly thinking he should have done the other thing, whereas I think most fans, when they watch the Avatar and the Fire Lord, are like, no, I don't think Roku would have been fully justified in taking Sozin out there, because at the time, Sozin hadn't done anything that was like that bad that he needs to kill him for what he's done. He couldn't possibly have known the acts he would later commit, type thing. And he's just looking at it from the past perspective and not necessarily at where the world is right now. And so Aang encounters some problems initially because he just takes things, the four nations must remain four, and he has to deal with the sort of contradictions of that when he sees the likes of Corey, sneers and Corey in a relationship, and then Katara brings up, his own relationship with Katara is two different nations. Does his views align with their relationship, and so on? And in doing the promise, would he not be contradicting his culture and all this sort of stuff? And in the end, he realizes he needs to do this on his own, so he separates from Roku. I think it's well done, and it's a big moment. Like, they obviously come back to it in the Rift, and it's a really good kind of reunion where I think almost like Roku learns from it, and Aang has learned in the intervening time. It was something that needed to happen to have Aang go off on his own, and it's interesting given that, like, I suppose by the time at the time this comic came out, like about a year or two later, we'd have Korra be disconnected from all of the past lives, and here's Aang choosing to disconnect from the one he had contact with. And it makes sense. I do really like what he gets from this, and it works. Like, there's just the idea of Aang realizing, you're not from this era, I'm in this era, I need to do this on my own right now. So what were your thoughts on Aang and Roku's dynamic?
Yeah, no, he is of this era, sort of in this new era, and the sort of ideas of the past don't always sort of apply. You can always sort of, take wisdom from them, which he definitely does, and it has, like he mentioned, it has sort of like informed his own sort of ideas and belief, but it's not something that's always going to be sort of like a one-to-one sort of comparison. So here I think, choosing to break off from sort of Roku's sort of direct advice, at least for, a period of time, I think was definitely sort of in his sort of, best interest. And, it's not that he's always going to get sort of like the idea, sort of right. I mean, like he mentions himself that he is sort of like a flawed sort of avatar, but, most beings, no one's ever going to be sort of perfect, even the avatar. So there's always going to be, somewhere where you're going to have some sort of issue about sort of what's going on. So I think it definitely, the way that they do it over the course of this book and sort of him sort of developing into being his own sort of avatar and even sort of, trying to sort of explain this sort of idea to sort of Roku and sort of, like you mentioned, sort of getting a bit of development from Roku, sort of just sort of mentioning sort of his relation to Zuko directly and sort of how that sort of influences things and sort of how, just sort of how Aang sees the world, I think in general, I think comes across pretty well in this book, just sort of his place and how he's, going to attempt to guide the world.
Mm. Yeah, like the scene where like Roku actually tells Aang for the first time that Ursa, Zuko's mother, is my granddaughter. Like that's a big moment because of course that was a shocking thing when we found out about that with Iroh telling Zuko, but now here's Aang finding out about that from the other side of things. It's really, really interesting because it adds to the whole thing of like you're asking me to like kill your descendant in all of this, that you're so lost in like the decision you did or did not make in the past that you're willing to urge me to go ahead with this promise here. And ultimately where Aang lies on this is that, it's his flaw. It comes back to the scene at the end of the book. It's like when he reflects on the world, he sees all of the people from all of the different nations who play a role in his life, and he just acknowledges by the end of the book that it's always going to be his flaw that he cares about the people he cares about so much, but he's willing to accept that. And I really like that. That is really well written Aang. That's exactly what we kind of want from him, and he learns from this book. And it's a little bit more about why, like, again, I have some criticisms of imbalance because I felt like he learned a lot as a leader in this book, and I felt like they sort of forgot about that in imbalance and just had him again, Aang be sort of lost, not having any opinion on things and just feeling kind of weird. But yeah, I really do like the Roku and Aang stuff because again, it's like they're setting stuff up across books. This wouldn't be resolved for another two books. There's consequences coming out of it, and again, it's like I think that's what North and South and Imbalance didn't really do. There's not a ton of takeaways from those books in terms of like, oh, we have to come back to this because this happened to one of the main characters. But what's your next talking point?
Yeah, I guess just sort of going along with this, just sort of more detailed with Zuko and his father and just Ozai and just sort of, finally getting those follow-up conversations, just sort of getting, to mention the whole story about, Zuko's sort of like indecision on the beach as a young sort of boy. I think, I don't know, I thought it was interesting just in general how they choose to have, these secret sort of conversations, and this is sort of, attempting to sort of inform Zuko on his, way of how he should be the new sort of Fire Lord, which is something that, of course, we see him struggle with throughout the course of the book, and just sort of, go back and forth about having sort of like the flames in the throne room, and just sort of, his general sort of, idea of what, sort of he should be or how he should act. I mean, just, this just sort of goes in the whole idea of just him sort of making the promise in the beginning with Aang.
Yeah, I think this is a great section of the book as well because this is where we get Ozai developed as a character. It's not really Avatar: The Last Airbender where that comes out. It's in books like this. It's in The Search. It's in Smoke and Shadow when we get the scenes with Ozai where he just gets to talk and be his character and not just the threatening villain. And that's what I like here. You can see his manipulation. You can see where Azula got it from. And that's, I think, all anyone wanted out of Ozai in terms of what his character actually is and just how, even though he's lost his bending, is powerless, he's still scheming here. He has the power with the knowledge that he has of, like, he's keeping information about Ursa from Zuko in all of this. And he knows Zuko will come to him for advice. And I like just the teasing about stuff of, like, oh, like bring me tea, like you'd have tea with with my traitorous brother. That it's almost like Ozai doesn't really like tea that much, but he's kind of torturing Zuko by like bring tea to me and we'll just talk over tea like you always would with Iroh. And yeah, the conversations they have are very interesting because it's clear like Ozai, it's like he doesn't care about Zuko, but he's aware that like Zuko has a problem with like decision making, and he was aware of that even when he was that young, of like he oddly sided with the weak more so than anything, and he just has Zuko think about that, and Zuko just reverses the opinion of like, I should have sided with the strong hawk, it earned its meal. And Ozai's like, no, wrong. The point I was trying to make here is that you should have stuck to your decision, not be conflicted. Just stick to your decision because you are the leader. Because you made a decision as the leader, it is by default the right decision. That you are not wrong. You shouldn't have doubts, basically, kind of type thing. And it's like Zuko sort of learns, I suppose, to just make some decisions and stick to them, kind of. But you can sort of see the manipulation here. It's like Ozai trying to sort of still like rule almost through Zuko, and that sets up a little bit of the plot in like the search and stuff like that. But it's really well done, and again, like with Aang, it leads to the scene at the end of like Zuko acknowledging that he's always going to have trouble making these big decisions. That's just a part of who he is. He's conflicted. He can side with the weak. He can side with the strong. It's just he'll always struggle with it, but he now knows better how to make the right decision, especially after everything he went through in this book. He's finally revealed to have actually made the right decision. It was right to side with allowing the colonies to stay because they've been around so long and the world is becoming more modern and connected and so on. So I really, really did enjoy this book so much. It was for just what they did with Aang and Zuko in these sequences with the talks with Roku and Ozai. But what are more your thoughts on the Zuko and Ozai stuff?
Yeah, no, I think him sort of coming to realize sort of his place and sort of role in the world, and sort of how his flaws, they're just sort of a part of him as sort of the character, and it's not something that he's necessarily ever going to be able to sort of lose. I think just sort of his, however his temperament, his sort of upbringing was, that he can sort of, view both sides, which is, generally seen as sort of a good thing, but just sort of his sort of upbringing has sort of, forced him to sort of look at that as sort of like, I think that might necessarily show the best sort of like strength in sort of like a leader. I think is something that, the book overall gets a good job of sort of showing, and I like sort of, him sort of coming, to slowly sort of realizing that, even though, it takes him along a road that, necessarily isn't sort of like the easiest sort of one, but it's something that it's just one of those things that's sort of a part of his character that we've come to sort of understand.
Mm-hmm. And then I suppose the last of our leaders, Quay, and his arc is he's all for the harmony restoration movement at the start. It's almost like at the very start of the book, the three of them have just gone along with this because it makes sense, and they come to realize the sort of nuance of the situation, and in the end Quay obviously basically almost goes to war with Zuko over this. We basically see a battle just about to happen because he doesn't like that Zuko broke the promise. And it takes Katara in a very nice scene actually being the one to sort of highlight to Quay, this is the problem. This has sort of been your problem the entire time. You didn't see what was happening to your people inside the walls because you sort of let it happen. You now are the leader. You have to be on the ground and see the people that you're making decisions about. And like Aang had over the course of this book, he has the same realization of looking at the people of Yudao and seeing that mix of Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom people and how happy they are, even though they're kind of different, and it's this artifact from the end of the war. He has to realize that, okay, I have to give this up because this is the way the world is going, and that his strong decision as a leader here is not taking back a part of his nation, but it's kind of being able to just let it go for the kind of progress of the world. And while I don't think Quay has had like the best development over the course of like the comics or anything like that, it was a solid moment for him as a character, given that it was more Aang and Zuko at play here with the Promise. But yeah, what were your thoughts on Quay over the course of the book?
Yeah, no, I think, the book doesn't quite focus as much on him, but just the fact that we see him sort of take any sort of action at all is progress from what we've seen him not do before. So I like that, he at least has, that sort of like one moment when he's sort of discussing with Aang, sort of like, the whole idea of you're not gonna like sort of the decision that I'm sort of coming to, and just sort of, how's General Howe sort of, actually sort of, take action, I think is, it definitely shows some progress on him, and just sort of him, later on coming to the realization, from the airship from above, just sort of cowering about things, sort of, when Qatar sort of has to sort of bring him down to sort of like, the ground level, so to speak, directly, just to sort of see how things really sort of are, I think is definitely, so a big moment for his sort of character. I mean, he hasn't really had that much exposure to the world at all in general. So I think, the way that they go about doing this without it being, a huge sort of focus on his sort of character, I think, it's done pretty well. I think there's definitely more that can be done with him, and that we see, later on. But I think it's, for what we see in this book, I think it's a good start of it.
Hmm. And your next talking point?
I guess sort of going with sort of groups of people, just sort of, I guess, the freedom fighters in general, just sort of, how, they're part of this story, and how, they're sort of for the whole sort of restoration. And then we have the whole idea of just sort of smears and siding with sort of, the other side, just sort of them coming to terms with just sort of how the world is, and just, them being so steeped into what, they've been brought up with, just sort of being, sort of against the Fire Nation for, all of their, particularly, young sort of lives, and how that sort of plays into things.
Yeah, I think the inclusion of the freedom fighters here, like you almost forget that they're in the Promise, but then you go back and realize they're a pretty big role in all of this, and it's I think an appearance like this from some of the minor characters that we were almost missing in balance. I think like we could have used like maybe Smellerby showing up there to add something, given that they're related to this like changing of the world type stuff, and it makes sense. They're the freedom fighters. They were initially under Jet, fighting against the Fire Nation, and they of course would still side with the idea of like the war's now over, let's get the Fire Nation colonies out, and it makes sense in terms of just following those ideals as they go forward. But then we learn that, oh, Sneers actually has a girlfriend, it's Corey, and of course he, over the course of the book, learns to sort of understand kind of her perspective, that, she does have that sort of dual identity. She considers herself Fire Nation, but she's an Earthbender, and that she's from Udao. It's not Fire Nation versus Earth Kingdom. It's just she's from this place, and because of that, she deserves to be able to stay here if she wants. And it's an interesting one of just like giving Sneers a little bit of the spotlight, allowing Smellerby to be a little bit of a sort of antagonistic character who's like tricking Aang at a certain point of this book so they can like attack and stuff like that. It's just a fun use of like all of those characters, and that they even get like the typical long shot joke of just like he touches someone on the shoulder, and it's like, that's a great point that you brought up there. And it's yeah, like I want to see more of these in terms of like Smeller shot as like a relationship. Like, are they actually a couple? Are they not? Like I'd like to just see more of them, especially now that it has been like 7 years since we've seen any of the freedom fighters. Can we come back to that? Can we get to see what Corey is like again? And in terms of like just in general, can we bring Yu Dao back into the framework here? Because we know it's part of the United Republic, and Aang separates it at the end. But it's hard to sort of picture exactly how close it is to Cranefish Town, and what Aang separating it has necessarily done at this point. Because at least when Kyoshi separated Kyoshi Island, it was clear it's a peninsula. It becomes an island. Here it just feels like, okay, it's just not attached, but it's still sort of held in the same place, and it's like, I want to come back to this sort of stuff, these type of topics like the freedom fighters. But what were your thoughts on the inclusion of these characters here?
You know, I thought it was really cool. I mean, that is definitely something that I sort of forgot that they were sort of part of the story. So seeing them again, I think was definitely really cool because I mean, they were, a pretty good part of the actual sort of series, just sort of finding, just sort of another group of kids that, are sort of like doing the same sort of thing that our main sort of characters are doing, just from a sort of different perspective, in general. So I thought that that was definitely cool to see them included in here and how they're involved in the story and how, they have a relation with Aang. So, it's another group of people that he has to sort of consider in his sort of decisions. So I think that definitely, it adds another element of just sort of conflict that Aang has to sort of deal with, just because, he can definitely sort of empathize with them directly just because of everything that they have sort of been through. So I thought that was definitely really cool to see them. And yeah, it would be cool to see them sort of later on, sort of where they're at, sort of, just, I don't know, I think, the future, it would be interesting to see in general any sort of, callback to these comics now that we've, they've been doing these series of comics for so long now, it almost sort of makes sense that they would sort of, reflect on the original sort of where things have been, just to sort of get a perspective of things of just sort of the state of the world. I think is something that, always could help in general, just sort of get an idea of the current sort of state of affairs. I think, maybe at this point we've gone farther enough down the line that, before or if or whenever they do sort of the time jump, that we sort of get an idea of everything.
Yeah, like I just want to see stuff like bring back Pipsqueak, bring back the Duke, and like cover stuff like why aren't they with like Smellerby and Longshot anymore, and like how's Sneer's relationship with Corey going, and that like I think Corey, I suppose the next topic is just Corey. I think Corey's a really well done sort of new character introduced here. Plays an interesting role. She gets to have action scenes at the start trying to kill Zuko, but she ends up sort of through introducing Zuko to her family, sort of changing his mind and has an interesting dynamic with Sneers of really trying to get that point across of that sort of dual identity that she has, and while I suppose maybe towards the end of the book, she doesn't feel maybe as important as at the start, I still think she's interesting enough that I'd love to see what she's up to now. So, what are your thoughts on Kori Morishita as a character?
Yeah, no, I think as a character, she's definitely really interesting. I mean, she forces Zuko Han to sort of think about the whole, situation in Yudao in general. So I think, from that perspective, she has a pretty sort of like important role just because that's sort of, the whole sort of crutch of the issue, just sort of, where her nationality lies, where, her family's from, where, just sort of how she views herself in the world versus, what the world would view them as. I think is a really sort of good point to make, and her having her as a character definitely forces everyone to sort of realize that, and her relationship with Smears I think is just one of those things that it adds another level to the series that sort of brings the point home to everything that's going on, and just sort of the relations that you have and how important that is. I think the whole idea of just the people in general, which is sort of like Aang's sort of greatest flaw, is just him always sort of thinking about the people. Having her as a character, as a new character, I think was done pretty well to sort of just get that idea across. I mean, she doesn't have sort of the craziest sort of development as being sort of a new sort of side character, but I think for what her purpose was in this book series, I think it works really well. And seeing how she might have developed later on, as far as her role in Yudao in general, I think is something that might be worth coming back to, just sort of as someone who could be another leader in this new world.
Yeah, and I suppose just like talking about Yudao here, like what are your thoughts on like what like it meant that like Aang separated the land and stuff like that? Like how do you sort of in your mind locate Yudao compared to Cranefish Town and link it all together as United Republic?
Yeah, that's definitely a good point to make just because, we have the whole idea of it being sort of separated, but it still feels like it's part of, the mass of the continent. It's not like you mentioned before, sort of like on its own, sort of free flowing. So that sort of idea, I mean, it makes it seem like it's just sort of another sort of like, side region of, what will become Republic United Republic City. I think is very interesting in itself, and I think, I don't know. It almost makes me wonder that it could be some sort of other, location that we haven't really sort of understand as much. So I don't know. I think I definitely would be interested in seeing how that's sort of laid out in sort of like the grander scheme of things. Because I mean, it is, pretty fairly large, and it has developed, sort of over time. So that's definitely, I don't know. It seems like it would be a cool like location to come back to.
Yeah, because I just want to see like geography wise, like if we ever go back to Udao, has it like moved out a little bit to sort of become a kind of island type thing,
Hmm.
or is it just that like they fill in the gaps that Hang made with some bridges, and then it's kind of like, did he need to do that? Um, Given that like at somewhere in United Republic, there's just like a border between what is the Earth Kingdom and what is United Republic. So, like, is there a need to constantly just like break the ground to show the difference? Um, as well as that, like it's kind of hard to judge in terms of like, we roughly have an idea of where like Cranefish Town is on the map. It's harder to place exactly where Udao is, and like, are they that close? Just how big is United Republic compared to just Republic City and stuff like that. That's why I want to return to this, because like, okay, like Aang and Zuko form the United Republic. We know that that's like canonically how it happens. So we sort of have a connection with Zuko because he helped to make decisions about this colony here. But we haven't seen Zuko play a role with Cranefish yet. So I think at some point that's probably something they have to come back to in terms of, I think, visiting Udao, making decisions about Cranefish and stuff like that. And it probably will be stuff like, okay, we need to have Water Tribe citizens allowed to live in Udao as well, or something like that. Um, I suppose next talking point I have is the whole what ended up being like, I think like one of the weirder sort of controversies with this book. Like one of the few things I really remember as being like, this is something people had like issues with this book, and it is the whole Oogie's Sweetie controversy that was happening throughout this, in terms of like it's being overused. Is this what like Katara and Aang's relationship is, and so on. Reading this again, it's like I think this works. I think it makes sense. Of course, Sokka would be a bit weirded out seeing Katara in a relationship and them being fairly open about it, and the word Oogie kind of representing that. And I think it works because they turn it into an arc. They have it be a plot point across the three books of like, he's constantly Oogies, then Toph is on board with it as well. But then the second Suki arrives and is next to Sokka, he's, uh, everyone's like Oogies about him and Suki. And then with the Sweetie thing, I think it's just meant to be the opposite dynamic that, say, Mei and Zuko have. They have the whole I don't hate you as the big thing that gets across how close they are, whereas Katara and Aang, it's just their relationship really is that good. It's really that, sweet and lovely and amazing that they just call each other Sweetie and have pet names, and there's not really many problems with it. So I've never really had an issue with that, and I've always liked the whole Sweetie thing as being a always recurring thing of that's what they call each other. What are your thoughts on this as the book that introduced Oogies and Sweetie?
Yeah, that's interesting. I forgot that that was sort of a thing when the book sort of came out. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, for Aang and Katara, I think their sort of relationship, having I guess developed over the course of the actual sort of series, seeing them come to this point here, it doesn't really other than it may be a bit sort of like cheesy in times in general, which I think is probably the point that they're sort of trying to get across in general on that. I think other than that, it doesn't really sort of bother me too much, and just sort of Sokka coming up with the word Ugi's to just sort of describe his feeling about seeing them being a bit more intimate. I think is, I don't know. I mean, as like sort of like the older brother is just sort of a weird thing in general to sort of see sort of in person, and then of course he goes and does it sort of himself, and Toph is the one talking about the Ugis. So I don't know. I think for what they're trying to go for and sort of the tone that the book sort of has, making that generally seem more sort of humorous rather than like serious, like sort of discuss that he would have in sort of the relationship in general. I think it works for that. It doesn't seem like he's against it or anything like that in any sort of way.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where like it's to the point where like I hope that when we finally get like Toph in the comics, who's like actually in a relationship, we get like maybe Katara as a joke, or Sokka saying Oogie's to her, or something like that. That's I think will bring it like full circle of just like it is complete. The trilogy of Oogies is now complete. They've all said it to each other. Um, yeah. Do you have any other talking points?
Um, I think that's pretty much it for me. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I suppose just on Katara and Aang, even though like it's all very kind of sweet and like over the top in a way with some of the relationship, that it does also have that really nice moment where of just Katara kind of the big turning point for Aang of just like I never finished explaining to you when we first visited Yu Dao, when I saw Corey's family. Um, I also saw our future, and we get that really nice shot of just, I suppose, what Katara sort of sees their future as. Them older, they have a child and stuff like that, and just that in throughout this book, I suppose, just Katara as a talking point is like you see that she is like the first one in a way to like latch on to the idea of like why can't this place be an exception in that like relationships like Katara and Aang and so on, Sneers and Corey, they need to be allowed to happen, and so a nation separate from the nations is a really good idea. I like that being brought up here, and the fact that like they sort of continued that a lot across a lot of the early books of like the search, like they has like a brief mention of like you're too young to be thinking about marriage, and they just kind of blush about it and so on, and that I think everyone's waiting at some point to see when they get engaged and stuff like that, because it has to be the couple that sort of like comes together first. So everyone's waiting for that. But what were your thoughts on Katara in this book and how she was used?
Yeah, no, I think that idea of her just sort of, being able to sort of reflect on just sort of her relationship and how that, deals with the current situation, I think is really, a good point to be made, and for her to have, specifically just because of her, relationship with Aang. So I don't know, I like that about her, just her, throughout the whole sort of series, she's always been the one that sort of is saying to sort of like slow down and take a think of things. Don't, jump into the avatar state full of emotion, because you may not make sort of the decision that you really sort of want to make. Even on sort of like the hectic battlefield, she tells Aang to sort of go away and sort of like meditate on the situation, because she knows that otherwise the situation that he might make might not necessarily be the best one, or the one that he wants to sort of live out without for the rest of his life. So just her able to sort of being able to sort of being really brave in general, just sort of jumping to Aang right before or when he's already sort of in the avatar state, I think is something that really speaks to her character in general, just knowing how much just sort of importance that she has in general, just despite the mass amount of power that Aang could have at any one moment.
Mm. And I suppose as well, just go back to the very start with the promise, like that she is the one who ultimately sort of like nods at Aang to accept the promise, and I do kind of like that initially, that Aang doesn't want to, and I think just like I suppose the talking point of the promise itself is I like how they get to it. I know a lot of people like kind of criticize this a little bit for like it's a bit like over dramatic and like really they're friends, like why would Zuko just ask this? But I like that the book took a risk, like the first Avatar comic, and within the first like 10 pages or so you have like Zuko thinking about the future of like what if I go wrong again, and using Aang to be like end me if I ever go bad, and how this lingers in Aang's mind about all of Zuko's decisions, and Zuko's struggling with his own decisions, and he's going to see Ozai, and it looks terrible for him. I think it works throughout the book to create just an interesting. It's not a full rift between Aang and Zuko, but like an interesting way to put them at sort of odds in a book, and I think it's well done to do something that risky between like basically the two main characters of the franchise, and how by the end of the book you can get it to a point where Zuko's just like, I'm sorry I asked you to do the promise, like I realize now I was using you as an escape hatch, basically. And I think there's a scene with Ozai before this where Zuko at the end of it says like, no, I trust the Avatar, and Ozai fires back and says, do you trust him more than you trust yourself? And he has no answer to that, and it's like, there's the problem with Zuko, if there is one in this book. It's that it's true in that, like, until he really figures himself out by the end of this and commits to his decision, he is in a situation where he actually does trust Aang more than he trusts himself, and that's where the promise actually comes from. And so I think it's actually a really good character thing between the two of them, and the fact that in the end Aang considers going through with the promise a few times, but in the end saves Zuko instead of, I suppose, killing him. And it's a really nice contrast that fits both of their characters and the arcs in this book, I think, really well. So just what were your thoughts on the promise itself and how it gets resolved by the end of the book?
Yeah, no, I think, just the idea of trust in general for Zuko is a hard thing for him to sort of wrap his mind around, just because of, all the ups and downs that he's actually had to go through, and just sort of him sort of finding his, or attempting to find his place in the world, just sort of, as the prince, as, sort of the new sort of Fire Lord, just sort of, everything sort of being thrown in his face. I mean, I think this is, something that his character has, always had to sort of deal with, and is something that, is just sort of the idea behind him sort of, like you say, making the promise just to begin with, because he knows that, he's always realized that he has these sort of flaws, and, at one time he thought, capturing the Avatar was sort of the best thing to go about, and now he realizes that that's not necessarily a thing, but he has this new sort of conflict and sort of Yu Dao. But I don't know, I think, it's interesting just sort of him being able to sort of, realize that these are issues to even sort of, I guess, make the promise. I mean, I think it is probably, a big sort of idea, just sort of, him to sort of, put this on Aang, and Aang sort of, not wanting to accept it, but eventually sort of, taking it into sort of consideration, and, possibly, even sort of going through with it, I think is, it's definitely a really sort of big thing. So no, I think that, I don't know, I think that worked pretty well for me overall, as far as being sort of like the crux of sort of like the issue that he sort of has, that he has to sort of develop with. I mean, I think, maybe they could have done it in, some other way that sort of would have got the sort of idea, across in general. But, I don't know, I think, making it seem, this sort of dire, this sort of serious, just sort of lends itself sort of the idea that, this is sort of, coming off of, 100-year war that the whole world has sort of been, in turmoil about.
Mm. And then, like, again, with the comparison to Imbalance, I think Imbalance could have done with something like this, like making one of the issues between the characters just a little bit more intense. Like, they teased it between Katara and Toph, but then, like we discussed a few weeks ago in Part 3 review, it's just like 5 pages at the start, and then Toph isn't involved in that section of the plot anymore. Whereas it could have been a very interesting thing to, like I said, like, instead of have Katara say what she said to Aang, to say the same thing to Toph, and maybe Toph learn from that like that's a very harsh thing to say, of just like, oh, just take this person's bending away, when like Toph would suffer so greatly because of that. But yeah, I think the final point has to be like the last 2 pages of the promise, and the fact that this is a book that sets up the book afterwards. We get the reintroduction of Azula here, in the place that we knew she was in a mental institution. It was this weird thing from the Nickelodeon website at the time, where like we did know that about her, that in the aftermath of the series she was put into a mental institution. So they make that fully canon here, and of course, Zuko hasn't been able to get the information um, from Ozai, so he's going to bring Azula in on this, because at the end of the book he acknowledges that he feels sort of disconnected from the good side of his family because he doesn't know what happened to his mother, and it's about him now trying to reconnect to the rest of his family. He's talked to Ozai. It's, I suppose that, you can question, like, did he really learn anything from Ozai here or not, but he's at least talked to him. Now it's time to try and fix things with Azula a bit, and also just find Ursa in the first place. So, I like this. I think we've really missed this from some of the recent comics. It's just the sense of there is a plan for what's next, whereas like we haven't had this in a while now. That basically since Smoke and Shadow, really, like we knew that like the rift kind of links into Smoke and Shadow. Smoke and Shadow links into the North and the South, but North and South didn't obviously set up that Imbalance was next, and Imbalance hasn't really set up that much apart from like direct sequel maybe, but do we really want that? I'm not sure. This was clear cut. They knew that by the end of this book, this is where Zuko was going to be as a character, and that this is what they need to do with Zuko next. And it sets up Azula's arc, and then Azula's arc is the thing we want to get back to as soon as possible, and that's it. And that's what I really like about this. I think a lot of people sort of forget that Azula does appear here right at the end, that her arc is the Promise, the Search, and Smoke and Shadow. So what were your thoughts on the book ending with a teaser for what's next?
Yeah, no, I think that idea works really well. I mean, clearly this was sort of like a thought out thing in advance, and, the whole idea of the search in general was, an idea that Bright sort of, tossed around beforehand. So it's not like it's such a new, sort of concept, but, just the idea that we have that sort of in the previous book, even if we don't necessarily know how it's going to turn out. Like, it's not like we knew how the search was going to turn out, sort of when this was all sort of coming out. But, we knew that it was an idea, and just, it has an idea just sort of even rooted in the show, which, there are plenty other sort of ideas that are rooted in the show that they, could expand upon. That would sort of work in this sort of way, but it's not something that we've seen recently. So no, I think, just seeing, her, Zula in the last sort of parts of this book, seeing the whole idea of just sort of the reflection of the mother, I think, it works pretty well for just sort of, giving just sort of general sort of hype for the next book when it came out. And it's probably why, it's one of the ones that's generally always sort of remembered, or if anyone ever has a question about sort of Zuko's mom, immediately someone will reference, the comic series.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, like you just look back on this, and like where Zula is right now, last time we saw her, is in a very different position to where she is here. She is clearly still crazed at this point to a degree, but she's different now. So she's already gone through a certain amount of development, and because of that development, we want to see the next step to, will they go full redemption or do something very different with her, because she is the character with the most like open path in a way. We don't know where she ends up or goes, so they could take any direction basically. Yeah, like other than that is the Promise. I think it stands out re-reviewing it here, discussing it here, that there is all the characters are used to like a certain degree. Like again, like I think it's a common thing across like all of the comics, like maybe Sokka not used as much as the others, but I don't think the Promise is like the worst example of like Sokka not being used that much, because he gets to play a pretty big role in the more kind of comedy section of the Toph plot. Suki comes back, so they get to kind of be the airship kind of trio again as the kind of battle's about to kick off and stuff like that. But it's still, I think, just overall very solid, and it really speaks to the fact that, like, I like the comics when they do big things with the characters, where they're willing to sort of take risks. Like I'll always praise Gene Yang for like the first Avatar comic trilogy being willing to, within 10 pages, like have a question like the Promise kind of come up, and put Aang and Zuko at odds with each other after their friendship was kind of what ended the war. And it makes sense, and you can get behind it, and there's issues for the characters in terms of like Aang has to form his own opinion. Zuko has these conflicts and is talking to Ozai, and Quay has his own issues as well, and stuff like that. I like this book because it just feels like all of the characters basically got some sort of development. Even Toph and the side plot got development, and we haven't been getting that. Like there is a difference between this and some of the earlier comics and where we are right now, and I hope we can get back to it. I hope that whatever's next for Avatar Comics, it is planned out a bit more and they can do something bigger that feels more like the earlier comics when everything felt like super exciting. But what are your final thoughts on The Promise?
Yeah, no, I think, overall it works really well. I think it does, like you mentioned, it has, enough character development from, most of our main characters and a lot of our sort of like side characters that it feels like it made sort of a lot of progression even in this one sort of book. I think, the fact that they were able to do this in this 3-part series shows, the strength of what they can do when they have, 3 arcs of a book to sort of go through, which is something that we're almost sort of like a little burnt out on, I think, now. Just sort of that whole sort of, concept and sort of, mode of telling a story, which is, the typical sort of like 3-arc story. But I think in this one it works pretty well, and maybe that's just because it was the first one, or maybe just because it was better done in this one. There could be differences on your sort of ideas behind that, but I think for what we see in this one here, it works really well to sort of get that idea across, to continue from this series, continue moving on, and to just sort of push the story forward in a way that you can see sort of an idea of where our characters are progression is something that I don't know if we're quite seeing as much in the most recent comics.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's been our re-review of The Promise. The next podcast will probably be our review of Ruins of the Empire Part 2. As I said, it's only like 9 days away, so it probably means we won't be a podcast next weekend, but we will do one the week afterwards to review Ruins of the Empire, which looks set to be a super exciting comic where they're doing something we care about, Azula arc, and it seems like they're using the characters well. So it seems like the Korra comics have finally figured out the right way to do stories. And then after that, the podcast after our Ruins of the Empire Part 2 review will be us going back to take a look at The Search, and of course, The Rift from there, Smoke and Shadow, and so on. So, yeah, that's been episode 206 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.